Engaged anthropology uses anthropological theory and method to benefit the communities they work with through forming partnerships that empower marginalized communities. Professor Sugarman's research in Akko, Israel, is one example of community engaged research in the field of archaeology. I asked him to describe his research.
Combination of an archaeological excavation, straightforward, old school academic archaeological excavation, field school training for students, some of whom will go on in archaeology, some of whom won't, and community engagement project in that we're trying to work in what is probably the most heterogeneous urban center in Israel in terms of Israelis that have been around for 1,000 years, Israeli Jews that have been there for 1,000 years, and others who have only been there for less than a generation, Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims of various different sects, people who have very long histories in the area, and people who have very short histories. It's the center of a religion called Baha'i, which is an offshoot of Islam. There are a number of other smaller sects that are there, a lot of different populations. And we're trying to get some of them and members of those groups to come together around the concept of a shared heritage, around a shared past. So people who may not be able to agree on what the present looks like may be able to find common ground on what the past might have looked like. The site itself is a site that was occupied first in the early Bronze Age, about 5,000 years ago, and continued to be occupied until about 2,300 years ago, when it was ruled by the Greeks after Alexander came through. After that point, the site where we're excavating was abandoned as people moved just a bit off to the side, about 1 kilometer away to the coast, which had shifted a bit, which is the site of what's now called the Old City. So the tell itself is a park in the middle of the modern city, and that's where we're excavating.
How would you categorize this project, and who is your intended audience? I made this visual metaphor of public anthropology to illustrate how the fruits of knowledge are produced through collaboration between academic researchers and community partners. The branches show the varying degrees of community participation and methodologies. Like nature, this process is cyclical, and the results of the research are intended to benefit the community. Community-engaged research also gives marginalized communities a say in how and what research should be done within their communities, equalizing the power balance between the researcher and the community members. I asked Professor Sugarman how he would describe his research in Akko, Israel.
Like I said, the project really sort of fits a bunch of different models. That's very old school archaeology in that we're actually excavating a tell. We plan to publish the results of the excavation. We're asking questions about the different communities that lived there, from Bronze Age Canaanites to Iron Age Phoenicians and Assyrians and Babylonians and Egyptians and all kinds of folks who came through. But it's also education and field training, and it's also advocacy in a way at a time when archaeology is either heavily nationalistic for certain populations in the area or something to be dismissed by other populations in the area. We're trying to get people to come together around the idea of being able to understand a shared past and to see the place as part of a long history, that their role in it is part of a long history in the place. One of the things we're talking about is an on-site museum that would have, as part of the museum, be part of the excavated site, the large trench that was first dug in the 70s and is part of what we're re-excavating now. But also working with school groups to try and figure out how to tie it into curricula in the elementary schools, to tie it into local exhibits, and to deal with the fact that the old city of Akko was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site about 10, 12 years ago. And so, although our site is not actually within the bounds of what was inscribed as a World Heritage Site, there are changes in the area due to tourism and due to world recognition that we're trying to take into account and to work with local populations to try and figure out whether there's some way that town policies, that city policies can both take advantage of this UNESCO inscription, but also to be sure to abide by what the inscription, the agreement to be inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, what that actually means in terms of responsibility for folks there.
What challenges in defining the community and gaining participation have you experienced?
There is no the community. That is the challenge, is that there are lots of different communities there, and that there are lots of walls that separate the different communities. So there is literally the Ottoman period city wall that's built on top of the medieval city wall that separates the old city from the new city, and the old city is largely Palestinian and the new city is largely Jewish, but a mixed population.
In an area where ethnic differences contribute to conflict within the community, a focus on the shared heritage may result in a common community identity, which will lessen the internal conflict and maybe promote the peace process in the future.
Simply in getting people to talk to each other, people to be willing to talk to each other. Part of the difficulty is in finding out who's interested in being part of the project. It is a city, a couple 100,000 people, so there are a lot of different populations and a lot of different representatives of those populations.
How are you overcoming the challenges of trust?
We have overcome challenges of trust. As much with the Arab communities as with the Jewish communities. The Muslim and Christian and Jewish communities all have issues of trust, and Americans coming in from the outside don't necessarily help solve those issues. But I think by not trying to impose our own ideas about how to do things and how to get things done, by not trying to impose our own sense of what a goal is, because our goals are very open-ended at this point, waiting for feedback from lots of different stakeholders and lots of different groups in the area. We've been able to at least minimize distrust. In some cases, at best, we're just ignored, which is not the worst thing in the world in some parts of the world, but we're trying to draw people in. And I think it's just by being open, by inviting people in, by putting ourselves out into the different communities and making connections. My colleague, Ann Killebrew, who teaches at Penn State, who's really the primary director of the American side of this research, has been working in Israel for a long time, since the mid-70s. And has a lot of connections in a lot of different communities. And a lot of this is her work in trying to draw people in, trying to bring people together, and to sort of capitalize on friendships that she's created and work relationships that she's created over the decades that she's been working there. So that's been, I think, the core process is one of personality, that just, there's no threat, there's no sense that we're coming in to impose our will. We want to use this site as an opportunity to bring people together and to bring people forward, and to have people think about their own history and their own commitment to that history. So I wouldn't say that we have overcome challenges of trust. I think the challenges of trust are in the process of being overcome. We plan to be there 10, 15 seasons to move forward on the project, and maybe longer if things go well and if we can figure out a good funding mechanism. So we have a long way to go, and hopefully by the end of that we'll be able to talk about how we overcame the challenges of trust.
How would you measure your level of success?
From the public archaeology and community engagement perspective, we measure our success by the fact that people are still interested in having us come back, that we can still get permits to work there, and that we still have good relations.
Where would you like to see this project in the future?
Continue. On the archaeological side, I think there's a great deal of information and data that can be extracted from the site, and that will be published and will be of great interest to a fairly large segment of excavators who work in the Eastern Mediterranean. But I would like it to expand in terms of the number of folks who live locally who are involved in the project one way or another, whether it's in the actual excavation or the processing of post-excavation, or studying different subsets of the data, working on some of the conservation projects. I'd like to see it expand more in terms of playing a role in school curricula, local curricula, so that folks who go to elementary and high school in Akko and Haifa and the surrounding cities learn something about it and think about it as part of their own history. To see it serve as an example kind of a counter-narrative to the common archaeological perspective in Israel that everything that has to do with the first millennium BC is about the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and is about the biblical narrative, that this is a site that's within the modern boundaries of Israel, but that is part of a different kind of history and a different culture. And I'd like to see that information get spread a little bit more broadly as well. So there are a lot of different ways to move forward in terms of the academic perspective, the social perspective, the community engagement, a number of different possibilities. And I don't see that we're limited in any of those ways. We should be able to continue in all of those directions. So I would just like to see it continue.
In the past, archaeology was used to promote Zionist and political agendas, creating high levels of distrust, not only of researchers, but between community members. Collaboration between Israeli and Palestinians has exposed both sides to one another's local heritage, resulting in some degree of understanding and appreciation for the archaeological heritage of the other.
In part because I was very uncomfortable with the direction that a lot of that archaeology was taking in terms of the politicized nature of the narratives that were coming out of those excavations. And when Killebrew, when the field director, brought me into this project, it was as a bit of a challenge in a way, that here's an opportunity to offer a counter narrative, to offer a bit of a corrective to that narrative that made me so uncomfortable. And I'd like to see that have an impact down the road. I'd like to see that play out in a way that is reflected in other fieldwork in the country. So I'm hoping that that has a long-term impact as well. That's one of the places that I'd like to see it head. And hopefully in the end to head, as I said, to some kind of commemoration, whether it's a museum, some kind of a museum on site, some exhibits in the city somewhere, or maybe in one of the museums nearby, any number of different ways. I'd like to see, even after the excavation is done, I'd like to see the material reflections, the material outcomes of those excavations be remembered and exhibited and become part of the local narrative.